Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "The Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." And he said to all, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. What profit is there for one to gain the whole world, yet lose or forfeit himself?" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
So on the second day of Lent, and just as a public service announcement, typically at Daily Mass we sing one of the Marian antiphons. So we've been singing the Ave Regina Caelorum, which is on those handouts in the back of the church. This year for Lent, I'd like to do something a little bit different, and I'd like us to start learning and practicing some other traditional Lenten songs. Right? The reason I do those Marian antiphons every day at Mass is not only to ask Mary's intercession, but also many of us were just not as familiar with some of these beautiful traditions of our faith. So I'd like that everybody learns along with me, and we get familiar with some of these riches of our heritage. So today we're going to be singing Attende Domine, which is number 346 in the green hymnal. So we'll be doing that during the offertory. 346, Attende Domine. We won't be singing the verses, we'll just be repeating the refrain. Okay? 346, Attende Domine. Also on the second day of Lent, we always have these same sets of readings that we hear from throughout the season of Lent. One of my favorite Lenten readings is the reading we get today, right, from the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy, as you know, it's the last book of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, all written by Moses. And Deuteronomy is the last of those 5 books. The name Deuteronomy, it comes from the Greek phrase which means a second law. Right? Deuteronomy is the second law. So some context for the book of Deuteronomy. Right? Remember, the Israelites had been liberated from Egypt in the book of Exodus, and they arrived to the wilderness, and they arrived to Mount Sinai, and it was there that God made a covenant with the people. That's where the 10 Commandments were received. That's when instructions were given to build the tabernacle, etc. Right? But shortly thereafter, or rather while God was giving the law to the people of Israel, as Moses was on the mountain, the people committed the great sin down below, right? The sin of the worship of the golden calf. And so because of that, the covenant that God had made, it basically got put on like a probationary period, you might say, right? And that probationary period is articulated in the book of Deuteronomy and also in the book of Leviticus, right? And the laws became much more restrictive. Right? This is one of the reasons why nowadays in Catholicism and Christianity, right, many of the laws from the Old Testament, like kosher laws and circumcision and things like that, we're not required to follow those laws anymore because they were a part of this second law, right? This Deuteronomic law in the book of Deuteronomy. Right? And they were never meant to be eternal commands, but rather the commandments during this time of the probationary period, right, which ultimately lasted until Christ's death on the cross. Right? So that's what the story is in the book of Deuteronomy. And the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' basically his final articulation, right, of all of his teachings. It's like his last sermon, right? And he articulates many different aspects of this covenant, this second covenant. And what we heard from this morning is basically the end of this covenant ceremony. Right? And it's very interesting, right? We hear that Moses says, "Today I have set before you life and prosperity, death and doom." Right? And literally, as he was doing this, he was giving commandments for what they would do when they would enter into the promised land, and they they would reread, right, these words, even after Moses was not among them and Joshua had taken over as his successor. And it's really interesting, right when they entered in the promised land, there were these two mountains. There was Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Right? And Joshua literally split up the people of Israel into two sides, two halves. 6 tribes on one side and 6 tribes on the other. And 6 tribes had to go up to the top of Mount Gerizim, and the other 6 tribes went up to the top of Mount Ebal. And there was this valley in between them. And that's where Joshua stood. So literally, as he was repeating these words of Moses, he said, "Today I have set before you life and prosperity, death and doom, the way that leads to life and the way that leads to death. Choose life." It's really amazing ceremony, right? It gives life to these words of the reading when you know that context. People literally standing across a valley from each other. And this idea of the way that leads to life and the way that leads to death, of course, is not only a part of scriptural tradition, but it's become a part of our Catholic heritage. As Catholics, we talk about the culture of death and the culture of life. Sometimes people mistakenly believe that that's only about abortion or something like that. But abortion is just one piece of the equation. There very much is an ideology in our culture, and really it's not just in our culture, it's from the beginning of time. There's a culture which is largely motivated by evil, and a culture largely motivated by God. And it manifests itself in different ways, and abortion is just one aspect. But you would also say that things like the hookup culture are part of the culture of death. You would say a culture which does not respect human rights and the dignity of workers. It's the culture of death. A culture which does not uphold the right of families to be the building blocks of society in any way that prevents families from flourishing. Right? That's all a part of the culture of death. And as Catholics, we believe in the culture of life. A culture which respects God's commandments. A culture which respects human dignity. A culture which respects truth and goodness and beauty and all of its manifestations. The way of life, the way of death. And all throughout our lives, we are presented with these choices that will lead us down one road or the other. Choose life this day. I call heaven and earth today to witness before you. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life, that you and your descendants